From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
A new year has arrived, and it's poised to be momentous. Americans will decide whether to give Donald Trump a second term in the White House or elect one of his Democratic challengers. Here in southern New England, Rhode Island is facing a tense year at the State House with the governor and House Speaker at odds. While in Massachusetts, Joe Kennedy is hoping voters will send him to the U.S. Senate. This week on Newsmakers, a political roundtable looks ahead at what you can expect in 2020. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me this week for a political roundtable to my right is my Eyewitness News colleague and our political editor, Ted Nesi, and we have political analyst Lisa Pelosi. Lisa, welcome back.
Good to have you.
And Eyewitness News political analyst Joe Fleming, and alongside Joe is a political analyst Joy Fox. Hello, Joy, and welcome to the program. It's good to have you.
Thank you very much.
Happy New Year to you all, and what a year it's going to be, 2020. And let's start nationally with 2020. I'm going to go around the table. Ted, we'll start with you with the Iowa caucus, and just briefly on this, and New Hampshire primaries around the corner. Who do you see separating themselves from the field of the Democratic candidates?
Right now, speaking today, the first name comes to mind for me is Bernie Sanders. He raised so much money in the fourth quarter of the year. He seems to have recovered literally and figuratively since the heart attack he had, and we all know he has extremely passionate supporters. And so I think for a while he was seen as kind of maybe fading out after a big year in 2016. I think he's in quite strong shape heading into the primaries.
Lisa?
And the person I'm looking at is our former Vice President Joe Biden, because Senator Sanders did so well 4 years ago in Iowa. He won New Hampshire. Where is Biden going to be? So who's going to be the number two person going forward?
Joe?
Well, I think nationally, Joe Biden. However, in Iowa and New Hampshire, nobody. They're all within 4 or 5% of each other. Anybody could win those two primaries. And if Joe Biden happens to win those two or finish first or second there, I think that's going to propel him on for the nomination.
Joey, who are you watching?
I think we've known the top four for a while. I think it's Biden, I think it's Sanders, I think it's Buttigieg and Warren. I think those first four primaries leading into Super Tuesday will be critical.
How much do those primaries matter? When we talk about Iowa and New Hampshire, it was in 1992. Bill Clinton didn't win either of them. He lost in Iowa. He came in second in New Hampshire, and I guess that was sort of like a...
He played it as a win.
He sure did. He sure did. And I think, the local guy won there at that time. But in 2020, how important is performing well in those states?
I think momentum, money, if you do well there. If Pete Buttigieg does well in Iowa or New Hampshire, it's going to move him on. It's going to keep his campaign going strong. I think Joe Biden has to basically just hold his own in those states in order to keep going towards a nomination. So we'll have some impact. Elizabeth Warren, she's moved up, she's moved down. If she doesn't do well in those two states, that's going to really cripple her campaign.
Paul Tsongas. That's the name. I could not remember 1992. Paul Tsongas won New Hampshire.
I just should briefly mention, there are other people with a huge amount of money who were non-traditional candidates. Andrew Yang, the tech entrepreneur, raised a huge amount of money in the fourth quarter. Mike Bloomberg, Tom Steyer are both pouring money. They're showing ads on our station, even though only the people in Massachusetts in March will be voting anytime soon.
Right.
So I think that just adds to me to the complexity of the situation right now.
Yeah, and I'm curious to watch what I think are the bottom four tier there with Senator Klobuchar, Senator Michael Bennet, Senator Cory Booker, and Andrew Yang. I think since we know who the top four are and have for a while, it'll be interesting to see if there's any breakthrough or anyone close to that and what kind of bounce they might take out of the
if someone can
early
just suddenly
states.
shoot up out of the bottom
And I think
tier.
that will trigger the fundraising.
Yeah, but with those people, it's going to be very difficult in Iowa because remember, it's caucuses. You have to go to a meeting for like an hour and a half to 2 hours, and you need to get at least 15% of the vote to be viable. So those people are at 3, 4, 5%. They may not be viable. Where in New Hampshire, when you're just going in there to vote, they could show up a little stronger than people expect.
And what's going to be interesting too is the lower four that you're talking about is who's going to be positioning themselves for vice president and who's going to be their endorsement. So it could see that they start coalescing behind a certain candidate too, the lower tier above the higher tier. So we could be watching for that.
So Iowa, New Hampshire, I want to talk about three other states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. A recent poll had the president beating all Democratic candidates in those three states that I just mentioned there, and those are battleground states. The school of thought is that is where the presidency will likely be won or lost. What do you make of President Trump's strength in those states, and does he have the impeachment to thank?
I don't know if he has impeachment to thank. I certainly think it's clear at this point impeachment is not some body blow to the president. I think somebody wrote the other day in a newspaper article, anyone who runs at this point in America seems to be able to get 45%, count on it, if they run under one of the two-party tickets. And I think the president has focused, ironclad on holding down his base, and his people think that base plus a few swing voters who are happy about the economy is going to be enough to carry him through. And right now, at least, their bet, it certainly looks like that's a viable strategy, but we don't know if it'll be enough.
I think that the president's strength is he's a big distractor. He's a great distractor. We see it on Twitter almost every day. I think what we need to also pay attention to is what's happening off social media, and he's building strong organizations and field operations and really targeting and strengthening the base. I don't know that the base is necessarily widening, but he's shoring them up.
I don't think the base is widened at all, but he's correct. Those 3 states are the key to this election. Forget national polls. I mean, he may lose the popular vote again, but he may win re-election because of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. If he carries those 3 states and hold on to what he has, he wins the election.
Is the impeachment a distraction to his message, though, as Joy brought up? He's a great distractor.
I agree. The impeachment is a distraction to his message. Look at the economy, unemployment, the stock market. He should be ahead by a lot more right now because of all the way the economy is going. People vote the economy. When Bill Clinton ran in '82, what was it? It's the economy, stupid. Trump should be talking about the economy and putting the impeachment in the background, but he's not. He keeps going to the impeachment, which is hurting him at this point. Now, it may help later on, but right now I think it's hurting him slightly.
Lisa, thoughts?
Yeah, I see the impeachment hurting the Democrats right now. And what's really curious about this election is it used to be who's the most qualified person to be president. Instead, on the Democrat side, we're seeing who is the most not qualified, but who's the most liable one to beat the President Trump. And when you talk about the strong economy and our historic unemployment, where are those candidates saying, I'm going to do better on the economy, I'm going to do better on employment? They're not talking about that at all. They're just saying, I can beat President Trump.
Right. But that's why I'm saying the impeachment's hurting Trump, because he should be talking about the economy and all that right now, and that will make him even stronger.
But doesn't it give him an opportunity to talk about the economy? Every time he talks about impeachment, he brings up, they're just trying to distract from all the good that I've done, all the economy is strong.
He brings it up, but what does he talk about mostly? The impeachment. And what does the media pick up? The impeachment. They don't talk about the economy.
And I think, to build on Lisa's point, whether or not it's hurting Democrats, I don't know. But it is certainly polarizing us more and more.
Well, that was House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's reticence going into the impeachment process.
We had the experience with Kavanaugh, and I think that this is even worse. And that
I also just think for a lot of voters, it's less about who's talking about the economy more. It's just their daily lives. How much is gas costing me? Am I getting a raise? Is it easy for my kids to find a job? Those kind of things. I think that's how a lot of people experience, is the economy good or bad? And I just think with unemployment this low, inflation is stable. I think a lot of people, you see, a Gallup had a poll, people feel better about their personal financial situations than they have in many years. I think that's saving Trump. If the economy went south, I think people would have less patience maybe for some of the president's behavior on Twitter and stuff, but they say, hey, you know what, maybe he likes to tweet a lot, but whatever he's doing, the economy's good, so I guess it's fine.
Well, why don't we pivot locally, because that, of course, affects people more directly than the national conversation. We can always get back to it. Ted, stick with you here. The governor was on Newsmakers in November, and you asked her what the budget deficit looks like, and she said, quote, "It's the biggest budget deficit I've had to close." Her estimate at the time, again, November 15th, I think it was $200 million. How is the governor, how are lawmakers going to close that deficit? Can you figure it out on this show?
Right, exactly. If I could, they'd be paying more to run OMB. I don't know. I think, and I've watched in recent weeks with all the end-of-year interviews, Kim Clunian talked to Governor Raimondo on here. We saw the Projo and others talk to them. They keep ruling things out that would bring in money to help with this. She doesn't want to do the Medicaid employer tax, she told the Associated Press. The legislators don't want to do marijuana legalization, which would be a little more money. Majority Leader Shekarchi ruled out broad-based tax increases in an interview with the Warwick Beacon. So that starts to take away a lot of the options they would have. And $200 million
Plus wants to increase spending at DCYF, wants to increase spending at the Veterans Home. She said both of those
exactly.
things.
So I think, I think there are going to be a lot of question marks. And frankly, I think one thing I'm going to be looking for is any budget, I won't say trickery, but cuteness about, moving.
Like scoops?
Scoops, moving stuff into the next fiscal year. That there's little things you can do that aren't necessarily best long-term budgeting practices, but that can smooth the numbers for the year. The other thing is, how much does the the governor just throw stuff in she knows the legislature hates to balance her proposed budget, and then they just have to figure it out.
Well,
during the
and that
session.
brings up recreational marijuana, right? So what, Lisa Joy, I'll turn to you on this one. We've heard from the House Speaker, we've heard from the Senate President, not interested in doing recreational marijuana this year, so it looks pretty grim for that to survive the budget process. What would have to happen for that to change, if anything?
Well, first of all, I think she is going to put it in because she needs money, so she needs to put a certain amount of money in to cover to make sure that budget is balanced. The Senate President and the Speaker are adamant that it's not going to happen, and I don't see them reversing that at all. I don't care what's going on in Massachusetts, Connecticut, or whatever. It's not going to happen in Rhode Island this year.
Joy, let me ask it a different way. You've been in the room where it happens, right? You worked for the Raimondo administration. Going into 2020, what would be your advice to her?
Well, that switches gears entirely.
Go
on
ahead, you
the
can switch
deficit
gears.
and the
Yeah,
budget.
yeah.
I mean, I will say with the deficit, it's something the General Assembly and whoever the administration is has faced for years now. So there's nothing necessarily unique there. I think as you start any new year, it's all about figuring out what those top 2 or 3 priorities are and really just telling stories and communicating and making the case as best you can using that bully pulpit. I think that we all know that behind every there's a person behind every number, and for those 2 or 3 top priorities, that case just needs to be continually made and told.
Do you think they run a risk, Joy, as someone who's in the room in the Raimondo administration, if you put recreational marijuana in again, that sucks up a lot of the oxygen about what everyone's talking about, and the governor becomes identified with, oh, she wants everyone to be, smoking pot this year, rather than the other things we know she's interested in, such as education or job training or whatnot?
I think specifically on that issue, it's coming. I think now it's not so much a policy question anymore, but a question of politics and the money surrounding that. And I quite frankly think that, to Lisa's point, that it will go in because she does need to balance the budget. And I think as a taxpayer in Rhode Island, I'm disappointed that we're not putting a good faith effort to collect that money that we are seeing going to other states. Regulate it and let's collect on it as well. And I think that that needs to be the message there. And I think it's up to you guys and good government groups to really keep an eye on this process because we are talking about a lot of money.
Joe, under 2 minutes left here. Can she find comment? We talked about stuff that, she's going to face headwind with the General Assembly. Gun legislation could also be another item there. Can she find common ground?
It depends. Basically, right now, the Speaker and the Senate President are united on what they stand for. As long as they stay united, it's going to be a little more difficult. She's going to put in a budget which may come out very different because she's going to ask for tax increases. The General Assembly in an election year do not want to put any tax increases in there. They got to find ways to cut the budget. So they're going to have to try to work back and forth. I think they will give a little here and there. But again, it's going to be very difficult to find common ground on the budget, I think, this year. I think the General Assembly does not want to put any increase in taxes.
I also just think, bigger picture, I think everyone should be a little concerned that we were just talking about how strong the economy is right now. The fact that we're talking about the governor's largest budget deficit in a strengthening economy with very low unemployment.
People are like, what is up with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, some of it is that the parts of the budget on autopilot, particularly Medicaid, just grow a lot faster than tax revenue. And as long as the budget is, as long as the state of Rhode Island is basically a health insurance company with some schools attached to it and not that much else, it's going to be very hard to keep revenue rising as quickly. But I also think, you just wonder, at some point there will be another downturn. We're not going to go for the rest of our lives without an economic recession. And so what happens to the budget if we're at $200 million in the hole going into a good economy? What happens in a couple of years when there is a downturn? That's something that I worry when we look out a couple of years.
All right, we're going to take a break on the program. Here's a headline for you. The population in Rhode Island actually went up. Will we be able to keep both of our congressional seats? Ted Nesi will have all the answers when we come back here on Newsmakers. Stay with us. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. This week, a political roundtable as we kick off 2020. To my right, Eyewitness News reporter and political editor Ted Nesi. And we have Lisa Pelosi, a political analyst, and also joining us, Eyewitness News political analyst Joe Fleming, along with Joy Fox, also a political analyst. Before we get to the population topic that I teased going into the break, Lisa, I did want to get to you on that advice question that I asked Joy, because you have also been in the room where it happens, working for the Almond administration. What would your advice be to the governor?
A truce between the governor and the General Assembly. They have not worked well together since she first became governor, and now she's in her 6th year. When she's out there saying she's going to use her war chest, her sizable war chest, to support candidates who support her issues, that means she's going to be supporting Democrats against Democrats. So she's put down a marker right now not to have the two sides come together, and I think she should do that for the betterment of the state.
I will say that line from the governor did not sit well. I was talking to a lawmaker a couple days before Christmas. They are all talking about that, and she didn't have the warmest relations, I'd say, with the rank and file in the assembly to begin with,
right.
And that, whether
total opposite of a truce, right? I mean, that's
right.
a declaration of war politically in many ways. All right, I do want to.
They're all willing to compromise on policy issues, but my re-election, we do not compromise.
Ted, you reported that Rhode Island's population went up a little, bucking years of decline. Does that mean the state's going to hold on to its 2 congressional seats?
Well, I was actually surprised. I mean, it looked to me like, all right, the other states are still growing faster generally, but when I reached out to Kimball Brace, who for years has drawn the maps in Rhode Island and is a real expert on this, he said, not so fast. He said, Rhode Island's now within 15,000 residents of keeping that 2nd congressional seat that they currently have. There's a lot of question marks there. How does the count go in 2020? What happens in other states? I think I'd still say it's more likely than not Rhode Island loses a congressional seat because we are still under. But I think it's not as much of a foregone conclusion as maybe we were thinking based on the previous year's estimates. And it really reinforces why, for those who want to keep that seat, all the effort going into, they're calling it the complete count effort, to count every person who lives in Rhode Island next year could really make the difference. And it's, of course, more than, as Joyce pointed out, as a former congressional staffer, it's more than just the congressional seat.
Yeah, I mean, how important is this?
I think it's critically important. I mean, I know that watching the horse race of politics is fun, and that's what we enjoy, but losing a congressional seat is a big deal. It's a big deal for the federal dollars that will flow into Rhode Island, and I think it'd be great if we could actually focus these conversations on the complete count through the end of 2020 in a really serious way. There are a lot of great people involved in that, doing serious work to try and get as accurate a count as we can.
And hey, if you want to be a counter, they announced just earlier this week they're going to pay $25 an hour. They just upped the wage, which makes me think in the good economy they might be having a little trouble finding enough people to do it.
Joe, let's go back locally here, and kind of pivoting off what Lisa was talking about, how the governor is going to fund candidates that support her policies. That makes me think about the Rhode Island Republicans that have had a rough go over the past few elections. Where do they put their focus in 2020?
The last few? They've had a lot of problems. What they're saying they're going to do, we've heard before. However, I think the Republican chairman this time really wants to focus in on not 100 and some seats, but seats they believe they can win. Basically on the West Bay, the West Bay and Western Rhode Island, seats that Republicans can do well, where Alan Fung had won, where Donald Trump had won. If they can find the right candidates, that's going to be the key thing. They need to find good candidates, just not names. They got to be able to raise money for the candidates, and the most important thing, they got to build an organization for these candidates.
But doesn't it hurt them that this is a presidential election?
Usually it does in Rhode Island.
Right.
Usually Democrats do slightly better with a presidential election. However, in the areas of the state that they're targeting, it should help them. If they were talking about Providence, Pawtucket, Central Falls, yeah, it's going to hurt them. There's no chance. But they're not looking at those areas. They're looking at like Little Compton, Situate, those areas where Republicans could traditionally do well. If they could find good candidates there, they may have a chance to pick up a couple of seats. I'm not talking about getting 20 or 30 seats, but if they come up with 15 or 20 good candidates and just zero in on those and raise them money, they could do some damage.
I always think of the map we saw after the governor's race in 2018, where it was basically western interior Rhode Island was all the towns voted red, went for Alan Fung, and then blue coastal Rhode Island almost in every case went for Gina Raimondo. And I think that speaks to what the Republicans should do. You've got if you're putting a lot of money into like the East Bay, where we see right now the Democrats seem to be strengthening, you're facing an uphill battle.
Exactly.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting here, and I've said this more than once, is having an R after your name in Rhode Island has not served many people very well. And if you've been listening to the speaker, he's been recently saying that we don't have a spending problem, we have a revenue problem.
Yeah.
John Robitaille based his campaign on that back in 2010. I'm sure you have clips of him saying that. So here we have a Democrat saying something that a Republican said a number of years ago. So what's going to be interesting this year is not only the fielding for the Republicans, but how many progressive candidates are going to be challenging the Democrats too. So are we going to have more progressives and then even the moderate Democrats being knocked out? So never mind a moderate Republican or conservative Republican being running for office.
Right, you have that group of Democrats already who are formed with Matt Brown. Some of them, though, they're going after the top leadership in the Senate. I don't know if that's the smartest thing to do, but if they come up with more candidates and some of the rank and file people, it could have an impact, there's no question. Which, again, they're spending money in the primary. Now they don't have as much money for the general election.
Is that a play-to-lose kind of situation? They would never say this, but to go attack them from the left to try and get the leaders of the assembly to maybe pivot to the left on certain policies because that's where they're being challenged.
I think there's no question they would like to get them to move more to the left, but I don't think these leaders are going to do that because they're being challenged. I think the people that are being challenged are pretty strong in the districts already. So I think it's going to be very tough to get them to move. But I think that's an effort they're trying to do. But at the same time, they may be trying to get them to move to the left by running primaries, but having other primaries where they feel they can win a lot easier to keep them busy.
All right, I want to talk about, because we have about 4.5 minutes left in the show. Big race happening to the north of us in Massachusetts. We have Congressman Joe Kennedy. He is challenging the incumbent Senator Ed Markey up there in a Democratic primary. How does the table assess this race? And I don't know, Ted, you would know better. That seemed rather quiet to me as of late. What does Markey do to combat the Kennedy
Well, I think,
name?
That's the thing. I mean, they don't have a ton of policy differences. They're both liberal Democrats. Kennedy's just a lot younger and is a Kennedy. And I think, they're going to put more flesh on the bone than that. And so you've seen Ed Markey is not rolling over. He's really pushing his progressive bona fides. He's doing a lot on the Green New Deal bill that he put in with Congressman AOC, Congresswoman, and all that. But I think, I don't, that election is not until September, and it's clear to me, I don't know how many people are paying attention to that at all, let alone the race to replace Kennedy in the House district.
In the fourth district.
I think it's just far away and distant in the minds of voters right now.
He's ambitious, so you're always trying to figure out, when is your time to go forward and not waiting to see. To me, it means he doesn't believe that Elizabeth Warren's going to win the presidency because if he just waited for that, then he could run for that seat. So he's already making a decision that she's not going to win.
I think early on, the Suffolk poll back in September had Kennedy up by about 9 points. But again, that's just a snapshot at that time. Things are going to change. As Ted said, no one's focusing on that race right now. Right now, it's more of a popularity, name recognition type thing. That's going to all change come July and August when people are really zeroing in on it.
And we saw, sort of foreshadowing of this with Patrick Kennedy, didn't we, here in Rhode Island? Even in the state race, who was he running against? Skeffington.
Skeffington, right. Won the House. He spent like $80,000 for that race.
My goodness.
And that was back
in the 80s.
Right. That was back when you spent $3,000 or $4,000 in a state rep race. Yeah. And all the Kennedy, I remember primary day, all the Kennedys were in at the polling places, greeting them.
Yeah. All right, so Ted,
actually, I'd like to just jump in there if that's okay. I'd like to just take a step back and say we have a sitting congressman who's been there for 4 decades. We've got a congressman whose family has been involved close to 9 decades. There is a third candidate in the race.
That's true. Yes.
She has about
Shannon Liss Reardon.
She has about $3 million. I think that it is important to remember that there is a serious candidate.
Yes.
I think Politico a couple years ago named her one of the top thinkers, doers, and visionaries across the country. And their first debate, I think, is February 18th.
Yeah,
and all 3 of them will be there.
And that will be big for her, I think. To remind, you're right, to voters who are just hearing about it as a Kennedy-Markey race, which admittedly the press is part of the reason for that, suddenly say, oh, who's this woman on the stage too?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I'm glad you brought it up. And even from a strategy standpoint, it's a reminder that there are 3 people to consider on the ballot that voters are going to have to look at when they go into the voting booth. And that does bring up the fourth. We have about a minute and a half left here. The fourth congressional race. Ted, we've been having the different candidates on the show. all of them are from Brookline and Newton,
Right.
but the district goes down, Attleboro's into Taunton and so on. So down in our area, how do they stand out with the voters down here? Because that's a big voting bloc.
Well, I think for one thing, I think they might struggle even more for oxygen because the Kennedy Markey Liz Reardon race, we should say, is the marquee race up there. There are 6 Democrats running right now. I think you'd be hard pressed to find many Democrats in the 4th district in Massachusetts who could name all 6 right now.
Yeah.
And so they're just going to have to really beat the band. I think the fundraising numbers that come out at the end of this month will be an important milestone in that race, just to see who is showing some credibility and some ability to get support, and who maybe it's just not there for them. You could even see some candidates maybe reassess their campaigns after that. But it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, you just have a lot. I like the word ambition that Lisa used. There aren't necessarily a ton of policy differences between candidates in that race either so far. You just have a lot of people who want to be a congressperson, and we're going to have to see who voters like.
30 seconds left. We looked ahead, looking back. Anything surprise any of you about 2019 besides the Patriots' terrible offense?
Well, my wish for 2020 is there are no more stories about Tom Brady, whether he's going to retire.
I cannot promise that. I think that's going to dominate the headlines for a long time. All right, well, thank you very much for watching. I want to thank Lisa Pelosi, Ted Nesi, Joe Fleming, and Joy Fox for joining us on the Political Roundtable. If you missed any of it, it's on WPRI.com. And your New Year's resolution is to subscribe to the Newsmakers podcast through iTunes. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.
You survived.